When mechanic Charlotte Evans bought an abandoned Camaro for just $600, she thought she was rescuing an old car. But what she found hidden inside would uncover a family's buried secret, one that had been waiting over 50 years to be heard. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. It was one of those cold autumn mornings in the small town of Willow Creek, where the mist hangs low and the air smells faintly of rain and rust. Charlotte Evans, a 34-year-old mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart full of patience, had spent her life fixing things' engines, watches, even people's hearts in quiet ways. She'd always believed every machine had a soul, every dent a story. So when she stumbled upon an abandoned 1969 Camaro at a police auction, its once golden paint now faded to dust, she felt something tug at her chest. The car looked forgotten. Yes, but there was something in its silence that spoke to her, driving it back to her garage. She could almost feel the echoes of its past through the steering wheel, like the ghost of someone who never truly left. That night, as the rain whispered against the roof and her tools clinked in rhythm, Charlotte didn't yet know that what she'd just brought home wasn't just a car. It was a confession waiting to be heard, buried beneath metal and memory. A week passed since Charlotte brought the Camaro home. The car sat quietly in the corner of her small workshop, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and old dreams. Each night after closing up, she'd work on it slowly, one bolt at a time, one breath at a time, almost as if she were waking it from a long sleep. She'd repaired plenty of cars before, but this one felt different. There was something personal about it. Whenever she ran her hand along the dented hood, she'd feel a strange warmth, like a pulse. The paint, chipped and scarred, seemed to hide more than time. It hid stories. One evening, as she pulled the passenger seat to clean beneath it, something caught her eye, a faint glint wedged between the floor panel and the frame. She reached down, brushing away dust and fragments of paper. Her fingers found the edge of something solid, metallic. It was a small tin box, old and rusted shut, the kind you'd expect to hold coins or keepsakes from another lifetime. Her heart skipped a beat. She placed it on her workbench under the yellow glow of the hanging lamp, the light trembling slightly, as if it too sensed what was about to happen. With a small screwdriver, she pried the lid open. The sound of rust cracking echoed through the quiet room. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded velvet, was a folded letter and an old photograph of a young couple standing beside this very same Camaro. The woman had kind eyes and wore a floral dress. The man's arm was draped gently over her shoulder, his smile sincere but tired. On the back, written in elegant cursive, were the words, "For when you find the courage to forgive me, Ew!" Charlotte froze. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was connection. She turned the letter over, her hands trembling slightly, and began to unfold it. The paper was brittle, like it might crumble if she breathed too hard. The words inside were written with care, though smudged with time and maybe tears. "To whoever finds this car carries more than engines and memories. It carries what I couldn't say out loud. If you're reading this, maybe it means it's time for the truth to see daylight again." Charlotte sat down on the cold concrete floor, reading every word under the soft hum of the workshop's lights. The letter spoke of a lost child, a war, and a promise broken. It mentioned a name, Eleanor Ray, and a place, the bridge by Maple Hollow. Something inside Charlotte stirred, the kind of ache you feel when a stranger's pain somehow becomes your own. She looked again at the picture, the smiles, The hope. The car that had seen it all. What kind of story had ended here, inside a rusted shell of steel and silence, that night? She couldn't sleep. The rain came down hard, tapping against the window like restless memories. She thought of all the hands that might have once touched that steering wheel, all the laughter that might have filled those seats. By morning, she made up her mind. She grabbed her leather jacket, slipped the letter into her pocket, and drove the Camaro out into the misty dawn. The engine coughed, then came alive with a low growl as if it, too, remembered. Following the faded clues from the letter, Charlotte arrived at Maple Hollow Bridge, a place she hadn't visited since childhood. The wooden planks creaked beneath her boots as she walked toward the railing. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. There, she noticed something, a small engraving on the metal beam, half hidden under rust. She brushed it with her thumb, revealing 2 initials, E. Her breath caught. Maybe this Eleanor Ray wasn't just a name. Maybe she was real, and maybe this bridge held the other half of the story. Charlotte stood there for a long time, the letter trembling in her hand, the sound of the river rushing below. She whispered to no one. "Who were you?" And for the first time, she felt the weight of generations pressing gently on her heart, urging her to keep going. The Camaro's reflection shimmered in the puddles near the bridge, like a ghost caught between worlds. It was no longer just an abandoned car. It was a messenger. When she drove back that evening, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the road gold. Charlotte didn't yet know that this letter would lead her to a forgotten family, a secret buried deeper than the car itself. But as she gripped the wheel and felt the hum beneath her palms, she smiled softly. Sometimes, the universe hides its stories in the quietest corners, in rust, in rain, in a mechanic's heart brave enough to listen. The next morning, Charlotte arrived early at her garage, the sunrise still fighting its way through the fog. The Camaro sat where she'd left it, a faint sheen of dew glistening across its hood. But something about the car felt different, now heavier, almost alive with expectation. She made herself a cup of coffee, but her mind wasn't on the caffeine. It was on the name that had haunted her dreams all night, Eleanor Ray. Who was she? Why did her initials rest on a bridge miles from town? Charlotte decided she needed help. She drove to the Willow Creek Historical Society, a small red brick building run by an elderly man named Harold Whitmore. He had lived in the town all his life, the kind of man who remembered every face and every rumor. When Charlotte placed the letter and photograph on the counter, Harold took one look and grew silent. His wrinkled fingers trembled slightly as he traced the writing. "This," he whispered. "I haven't seen that handwriting in 40 years. Charlotte's heart pounded. "You knew them." Harold nodded slowly. Eleanor Ray and Richard Evans. They were sweethearts back in '69. She was a teacher. He worked at the mill. That Camaro was his pride. Everyone in town knew it. But one day, he just disappeared. Charlotte leaned forward. Disappeared. Harold sighed, eyes distant. There was talk of a fight, something about a letter she found. Folks said Eleanor was pregnant. Others said she left town, heartbroken. No one really knew. The car turned up abandoned a few weeks later. People assumed it was stolen or wrecked. Then the years went on, and everyone just forgot. Charlotte felt chills run down her arms. That old tin box, that letter, it wasn't just a coincidence. She realized she was holding the missing piece of someone's life, a wound frozen in metal and dust. Harold looked at her with soft eyes. "If you've got that car, Maybe it's trying to tell you something. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried because it's waiting for someone to care enough to dig it up. Charlotte thanked him and left with a notebook full of old addresses and a single burning question in her chest. What happened to Eleanor Ray? That evening, back in her workshop. The wind howled through the open doors as the storm rolled in. Charlotte sat inside the Camaro, staring at the dashboard. The radio, broken for decades, crackled faintly with static, a ghostly hum that shouldn't have been there. She laughed nervously. Great! Now you're haunted too. Then she noticed something, a small slit beneath the glove compartment. Barely visible, but definitely there. She reached under, her fingers brushing against a thin metal edge. A hidden compartment. Again. Her pulse quickened. With gentle pressure. She popped it open. Out fell a bundle of old cassette tapes, wrapped in a cloth that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The labels were handwritten, each with a date. The first read, Eleanor, January 1970. Charlotte found her old cassette player, the kind she used to play music from her father's workshop, and placed the tape inside. The room filled with a soft crackle. Then a woman's trembling voice. Richard, if you're hearing this, I need you to know I didn't mean to run. I just couldn't stay after what happened. I saw the letter you left. I know the truth now about the child, about your brother. But please, if you ever come back, find me at Maple Hollow. I'll be waiting. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. The voice was fragile, trembling, full of love and regret. She let the tape play until silence returned, but the silence wasn't empty. It was thick with emotion, the kind that made your throat tighten. She looked around the workshop, tears blurring her vision. The Camaro wasn't just a car anymore. It was a time capsule of heartbreak, a vessel carrying two people's last words to each other. When she replayed the tape, she noticed faint background noise, the sound of waves, and something metallic clinking, like a chain swaying in the wind. She realized it wasn't waves. It was the bridge. Maple Hollow Bridge. That's where Eleanor said she'd wait. The next day, Charlotte returned to the bridge, this time with purpose. The morning fog rolled in thick, wrapping the world in silence. She parked the Camaro near the edge and stepped out, holding the cassette in one hand, the letter in the other. She walked toward the railing, whispering softly into the air, Eleanor, I found it. I found what you left behind. Then, out of the mist, an elderly woman appeared, leaning on a cane. Her silver hair glowed softly in the sunlight, breaking through the clouds. You're standing where my mother used to wait, she said gently. Charlotte's heart stopped. Your mother, the woman nodded. I'm Margaret Ray. Eleanor was my mother. I never knew my father. All I have of him is a name, Richard Evans, and the car he drove away in. Charlotte felt her knees weaken. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She simply held up the letter, her eyes filling with tears. Margaret's lips trembled as she took it, unfolding it like a prayer. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the river below and the soft sob of a daughter finally touching a piece of the father she'd never known. That was the day Charlotte realized she wasn't just fixing an old car. She was restoring a family's missing heartbeat. The drive back from Maple Hollow that afternoon felt different. The same road that had always looked gray and lifeless now shimmered in soft sunlight, as though the world itself had taken a deep breath. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly on the wheel, but not from fear, from something gentler. Reverence, maybe. She had gone there chasing a mystery. What she found instead was a mirror, a reflection of her own loneliness and quiet yearning. When she parked the Camaro back in her garage, she sat there for a while, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. It sounded almost human, like the car was exhaling after decades of holding its breath. On her workbench, the photograph of Richard and Eleanor sat framed now, beside the old tin box and the cassette tapes. She'd cleaned each one gently, as if she were caring for relics. These weren't just clues anymore. They were fragments of a love that had refused to die, even when time tried to erase it. Charlotte thought about Margaret Ray, the daughter who'd grown up never knowing her father, and the way her voice trembled when she held that letter. There was a quiet dignity in her grief, the kind that comes from a lifetime of unanswered questions finally being heard. That night, Margaret came to the garage. She stood there, looking at the Camaro, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "So this was his?" she asked softly. Charlotte nodded. "It was—" Margaret walked around the car, running her fingertips along the faded paint. "My mother never talked about him much," she said. "Just that he loved cars, and that he used to hum old country songs when he drove." She said his laugh could fill a room. Charlotte smiled. "Sounds like the kind of man who left more behind than just silence." Margaret looked at her, and in that glance, there was an unspoken understanding that some losses never really leave you. But if you're lucky, you get to meet someone who helps carry the weight. Over the next few weeks, they worked together to restore the Camaro, not just for its beauty, but for what it represented. The old metal, once rusted and brittle, began to shine again. Margaret painted the fenders herself, hands steady, tears occasionally falling onto the surface. Charlotte didn't say a word she didn't have to. The silence between them spoke louder than any comfort could. As they worked, they found more traces of Richard's life. A matchbox wedged behind the seat with the logo of a diner long closed. A worn-out lighter with initials engraved I.R.E. And beneath the back seat, a tiny bracelet small enough for a baby's wrist. Margaret picked it up with trembling fingers. "I think this was mine," she whispered. Charlotte swallowed hard, the air thick with emotion. "Then I guess this car really did carry your story all along." They decided to name the restoration project Eleanor's Echo. It wasn't just about reviving a car, it was about giving a voice to the memories that had been silenced by time and regret. One night, after Margaret had gone home, Charlotte stayed behind. The moonlight spilled through the open doors, silver and still. She leaned against the Camaro, her reflection caught faintly in the polished chrome. For years, she had buried herself in engines and gears, telling herself it was enough that fixing broken things was her purpose. But now she saw it differently. Maybe she'd been trying to fix herself. Her father had been a mechanic, too. He'd passed away when she was 16, leaving behind a small note taped to her toolbox. "Keep your hands busy and your heart open." She'd followed that advice ever since, though she never fully understood it until now. This journey, this mystery, this family she'd stumbled into it had cracked something open inside her. Charlotte realized that machines weren't the only things capable of revival. People were, too. Sometimes all it took was faith, and the courage to open what others had closed. When the Camaro's engine finally roared to life again after months of work, both women stood back, tears running freely. "It sounds like him," Margaret said through a smile. "Strong, but gentle." Charlotte nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "He'd be proud. You both would." Margaret turned to her. "You didn't just fix his car. You brought him home." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The garage filled with the deep hum of the Camaro like a heartbeat echoing through time. Charlotte looked at Margaret and said quietly, "I think sometimes we find the things we need most when we stop searching for ourselves." Margaret smiled softly. Maybe that's what forgiveness sounds like. And as the two women stood in the warm glow of the workshop lights, surrounded by the hum of the resurrected engine. Charlotte realized something she'd never said out loud before. This wasn't just Richard and Eleanor's story anymore. It was theirs. Two women, bound by grief, healing, and the quiet miracle of second chances. Weeks had turned into months since the Camaro first rolled into Charlotte's life. The small garage that once echoed with the cold clank of tools now felt like a living, breathing heart beating in rhythm with the hum of the restored engine. Margaret visited often, always carrying something new: old photographs, newspaper clippings, tiny fragments of a life that once seemed lost. Together, they pieced those fragments into something whole again. One morning, Margaret arrived holding a worn leather journal. The pages were soft and fragile, smelling faintly of dust and pine. "This was my mother's," she said quietly. "I found it tucked inside an old trunk after she passed. I think she wanted me to have it when I was ready." Charlotte took the book with reverence, her fingertips brushing over the name on the cover, Eleanor Ray Evans. Inside were pages of entries written in delicate cursive thoughts. Memories. Dreams. But one passage made Charlotte pause. "If someday this car finds its way home, may it carry with it the forgiveness I never had the chance to give. May whoever finds it remember that love, no matter how broken, is still love." Charlotte closed her eyes. The room seemed to exhale around her. That single sentence felt like a bridge connecting the living and the gone, the broken and the mended. Margaret smiled through tears. "I used to think the past only hurt, but now I see it can heal too. I want to share their story. Charlotte. Not just for me, for them. For anyone who's ever lost something they thought they'd never find again." Charlotte nodded. "Then let's do it." They decided to host a community restoration show, a gathering where townsfolk could share their old cars, heirlooms, and stories of what they'd meant. Charlotte offered to display the Camaro as the centerpiece, not as a prize, but as a testament. Word spread quickly. The town of Willow Creek hadn't seen excitement like this in years. On the day of the event, the sun shone golden across the streets, glinting off polished hoods and chrome grills. People wandered between vehicles, sipping coffee, swapping stories about their father's old trucks and first loves in back seats. Charlotte stood near the Camaro, her hands nervously clasped. It gleamed in the sunlight, the deep bronze paint catching fire every time the light shifted. On the passenger seat sat the framed photograph of Richard and Eleanor, the letter beside it, and a small note that read, "Found, restored, remembered." Margaret arrived wearing a soft cream dress and a pendant with her mother's initials. She took Charlotte's hand. "She'd be so proud," she whispered. When the crowd gathered, Margaret stepped forward and began to speak. Her voice quivered at first, but soon grew steady. She told them about her mother and father, about the secrets that silence had buried, and the stranger who helped unearth them. Charlotte watched as faces softened, eyes filled. People weren't just listening, they were remembering their own lost letters, their own unanswered goodbyes. By the time Margaret finished, even the wind seemed to hold still. Then came the sound of applause, not loud or showy, but warm, real. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was healing. Later that evening, when the crowd had gone and the sun dipped low behind the pines, Charlotte stood beside the Camaro, lost in thought. Harold Whitmore, the old historian, walked over slowly, leaning on his cane. "You did good, Charlotte," he said with a soft smile. "You gave a story back to a town that forgot how to tell one." Charlotte looked at the car. I think the story gave itself back to us." He chuckled. "Maybe. But someone had to listen first." That night, after everyone left, Charlotte stayed behind to lock up. The garage was quiet, except for the steady drip of water from a leaky pipe. She ran her hand over the Camaro's hood one last time before heading home. Then, something caught her eye, a faint reflection on the windshield. She turned. For just a moment, she swore she saw them. Richard and Eleanor standing together in the corner of the garage, smiling, the faint shimmer of moonlight catching where their hands touched. Charlotte blinked, and they were gone. But she didn't feel afraid. She smiled. "You're welcome," she whispered. The following week, Margaret called with an idea. "What if we start a foundation?" she said. "Something to help restore old things cars." "Sure, but also letters, diaries, anything with a story worth saving." Charlotte's heart swelled, like a sanctuary for lost memories. Exactly. And so, the Willow Creek Restoration Project was born, a small non-profit dedicated to preserving pieces of the past that might otherwise fade away. People began sending in their own discoveries, old boxes, love letters, photos, even broken radios. Charlotte's garage transformed into a museum of human memory, humming with laughter and second chances. Each item had a story. Each story found a listener. And through it all, the Camaro stayed in the corner, shining, patient, eternal like a heartbeat made of chrome and ghosts. For the first time in her life, Charlotte didn't feel alone. She wasn't just fixing cars anymore. She was restoring lives, one story at a time. And in that purpose, she found something she hadn't known she was missing: peace. Autumn returned to Willow Creek, painting the town in burnt gold and copper. Leaves drifted down like silent confessions, covering the streets where Charlotte once drove that forgotten Camaro for the first time. It had been nearly a year since that day. The Willow Creek Restoration Project had grown beyond what she ever imagined. People from neighboring towns came with their stories, some carrying rusted keepsakes, others bringing memories they'd hidden for decades. But for Charlotte, it wasn't just about restoration anymore. It was about redemption. Still, even amid the laughter and gratitude of others, a quiet emptiness lingered in her. Late at night, when the garage lights dimmed and the world fell silent, she'd find herself staring at the Camaro, whispering to it like an old friend. "What do I do now?" she'd ask softly. "How do I move on when everything inside me still wants to stay here?" One cold November morning, she received a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real letter, with a faint scent of lavender on the envelope. It was from Margaret Ray. "Charlotte, I wanted you to know that I found something. I went through my mother's things again, and hidden inside one of her old music boxes was another tape dated February 1970. I haven't listened to it yet. Would you come over? I don't think I can do this alone." Charlotte's hands shook as she folded the letter. A familiar ache bloomed in her chest, that feeling she always got before life changed again. That evening, she drove through the cold mist to Margaret's small white house at the edge of town. The porch light flickered weakly, and the smell of cinnamon drifted through the open door. Inside, the old cassette player sat on the table between them. The tape, marked in Richard's handwriting, was already loaded. Margaret hesitated, tears glinting in her eyes. "Do you want to press play?" Charlotte nodded. The tape hissed softly. Then a man's voice filled the room, warm, trembling, raw. "Eleanor, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it back. I'm sorry. I tried to fix what I broke, but I ran out of time. Tell our daughter that I loved her, that she was the only good thing I ever did right. And tell whoever finds this car, thank you for giving my heart a second chance to be heard." The tape clicked to a stop. Neither woman moved. The room was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't demand words. Margaret's sobs came quietly at first, then stronger, until her whole body trembled. Charlotte reached out, holding her hand, tears streaming down her own cheeks. "He never stopped loving her," Margaret whispered, "even when the world forgot him." Charlotte nodded. He didn't want to be remembered for his mistakes. He wanted to be remembered for his love. They sat like that for a long time, two women bound not by blood, but by compassion. After that night, something changed in Charlotte. She started to dream again. Not of broken cars or missing pieces, but of stories, voices she hadn't yet heard. People she hadn't yet helped. She began organizing small memory nights at the garage, inviting anyone who wanted to share their past. One night, an old man brought a box of letters he'd written to his wife during the war. Another woman showed up with her grandmother's wedding ring, tarnished and forgotten in a drawer. Every item, every story, brought Charlotte to tears, not from sadness, but from the sheer beauty of people remembering how to feel again. And then came a young boy named Eli, about 10 years old, holding a cracked photo frame. "This was my dad's," he said shyly. "He died last year in an accident. Mom says I should throw this away because it's broken, but—" Charlotte knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "You know something? Eli, sometimes broken things are the ones that tell the best stories." He looked up at her with wide eyes. "Do you think you can fix it?" She smiled through her tears. "No, sweetheart. But I can help you remember why it's worth keeping." That night, after everyone left, Charlotte stood alone in the garage, the Camaro gleaming softly under the light. She could almost hear Richard's voice, not from the tape, but in her heart. "Keep your hands busy and your heart open." Her father's words, the same ones she'd read years ago. She looked up at the ceiling, eyes wet but peaceful. "Dad, I think I finally understand." She walked to the Camaro, rested her hand on the hood, and whispered, "Thank you for everything you brought me." Outside, snow began to fall soft, slow, and forgiving. Later, she took a drive through town. The streets were quiet, wrapped in white. When she crossed Maple Hollow Bridge, she slowed down. The reflection of the car shimmered on the icy water below. For a brief, impossible moment, she thought she saw them again, Richard and Eleanor, standing by the bridge, holding hands, smiling at her. Charlotte blinked back tears and whispered, "You can rest now." Then she pressed her foot gently on the gas, and the Camaro glided forward not as a relic of the past, but as a messenger of everything she'd learned. That love never dies, that even in silence, there are voices waiting to be heard, and that sometimes the one who fixes others finally learns how to heal herself. The following spring, Willow Creek woke to the scent of rain and blooming magnolias. The long winter had finally broken, and with it, something inside Charlotte had softened too. The Willow Creek Restoration Project had become more than just a local effort. It had become a movement. News stations came from nearby towns to cover what they called the garage that heals. Reporters wanted to know why people drove hours just to sit in a dusty shop surrounded by broken things. Charlotte always gave the same answer, because sometimes broken things remind us we can still be whole. She never said it to sound poetic. She said it because she believed it, because she had lived it. One morning, she arrived early to open the garage and found a letter taped to the door. It was addressed to the woman who restores souls. Inside was a simple note. "You don't know me, but my grandfather was Richard Evans' brother. My family thought he'd abandoned everyone. We never knew the truth until we saw the news about your project. You gave my grandfather his brother back. Thank you for healing something we didn't even know was still broken." Charlotte pressed the note to her chest. tears welling. Every story she'd touched had somehow touched her back. Every wound she helped heal had softened her own scars. The Camaro still sat in the corner, polished to a warm gleam. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a monument, a promise kept. People who visited would stand beside it in silence, as if listening to the hum of love still trapped inside its frame. Later that week, Margaret returned with a small box wrapped in faded blue paper. "It's time," she said softly. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Time for what?" Margaret smiled through tears. "To say goodbye properly this time." Inside the box were the 2 cassette tapes, the letter and the photograph of Richard and Eleanor. Together, they drove to Maple Hollow Bridge, the place where everything had started and ended. The air was crisp and golden. Birds wheeled above the water as if escorting them. They stood side by side at the railing, 2 women, 2 souls, bound by a story that wasn't theirs, but had somehow saved them both. Margaret took the items gently, kissed the photograph, and whispered, "You can rest now." "Mom, he came back just not the way we thought." Then she dropped the box into the river. It floated for a moment, spinning slowly, before sinking beneath the shimmering surface. Charlotte felt the tears slip free, warm against the cool wind. "They're finally together," she murmured. Margaret nodded. "So are we." On their way back, Charlotte asked, "What will you do now?" Margaret smiled. "Live. Really live. For them." Charlotte nodded, her voice soft. "Me too." When she returned to the garage that evening, the sun was setting, spilling amber light across the tools and workbenches. Dust motes drifted like tiny memories in the air. The Camaro gleamed beneath it all, and for a heartbeat, Charlotte thought she saw movement in the reflection, a man's silhouette in the driver's seat, a woman's hand resting gently on his arm. She smiled. "You can drive now?" she whispered. "The road's clear." That night, she sat by the window of her small house, a cup of coffee cooling beside her. The radio, the same one she'd used for years, crackled softly, then played an old country song. The lyrics spoke of forgiveness, of coming home, of love that outlives everything. Charlotte closed her eyes. In the silence between the notes, she could almost hear them, her father's voice, Richard's laughter, Eleanor's whisper, all of them layered like threads in a tapestry of time. For years, she'd thought her purpose was to fix what was broken, but now she knew it was to listen, to give the lost a voice, to give the forgotten a heartbeat again. She stood and looked out over Willow Creek. The town lights shimmered like constellations, each one a story, each one alive. And somewhere, deep inside, Charlotte felt peace, the kind that doesn't fade when the day ends, the kind that stays, gentle and steady, like the hum of a well-tuned engine. Weeks later, on the anniversary of the project's founding, the community gathered again not to mourn, but to celebrate. Families brought photos, children played between the cars, and laughter filled the air. Margaret stood beside Charlotte on the stage, their eyes shining as they looked out at the sea of faces. Charlotte took the microphone, her voice soft but strong. "We spend so much of our lives running from the past," she began. "But sometimes, the past isn't there to haunt us. It's there to remind us of who we really are. Every car, every letter, every story in this garage, they're proof that love never really leaves. It just waits for someone to find it again." The crowd fell silent, the moment glowing with warmth. Then came the sound of applause, thunderous, heartfelt, endless. Margaret leaned close, whispering, "They're proud of you, you know." Charlotte looked up at the sky. where the clouds broke just enough for sunlight to pour through like a blessing. "I know," she whispered back. As the crowd began to disperse, Charlotte ran her fingers one last time across the Camaro's gleaming hood. The reflection of the sunset danced across it, bright and golden. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was fixing something broken. She felt like she was whole. Charlotte's story isn't just about an old car or a hidden letter. It's about how truth finds its way back through time. The Camaro wasn't a relic of loss. It was a messenger of forgiveness. It carried the echoes of two people who loved each other fiercely, but were torn apart by circumstance, and it found the one person brave enough to listen. Through Charlotte's hands, the past found peace. Through her heart, strangers found connection. She learned that healing isn't about forgetting what broke us. It's about remembering who we became because of it. The rust, the dust, the pain, none of it was wasted. Every dent was a memory. Every scar was proof that something once lived, once mattered. And maybe that's the real miracle, not that Charlotte fixed a car, but that in doing so, she fixed the silence between generations. The mechanic who once mended machines had become the woman who helped others find healing. Because for Charlotte, and for everyone who's ever carried something broken, the past was never the end. It was only the beginning, the end. Up next, 2 more unforgettable true stories of redemption and hope. Click now to keep watching, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe every broken thing deserves a second chance.